A valuation is a document that's put together by a registered valuer who physically visits your property and then looks at market data to provide an estimate on the value of that property. A valuation is not always needed by the bank, and in most cases it's actually not needed at all. Banks use what's called desktop or electronic valuations. They use these by default, and they often are satisfactory to support the lending without the requirement of going and getting a full valuation. However, these desktop valuations are not perfect. They do have ranges, and sometimes they do not reflect the true value of a property, and therefore a valuation can be required to support your lending. So there are three most common reasons why a valuation may be needed by a bank. The first one is if you pay, or you're intending to pay, a value of the property that is higher than the bank's desktop valuation, they may require a valuation to support the purchase. For example, if you're intending to pay $800,000 for a property, but the desktop valuation only shows $600,000, that triggers a flag for the bank that you may be paying higher than the true value of the property, which is a risk for them and a risk for you, and therefore they want a full valuation done to support the lending, to make sure that you're not overpaying and therefore they're not overextending on that property. The general rule here is around 10%, higher than the valuation figure that they have internally. So if you exceed that 10%, they may require a valuation. If you're within that 10%, you probably won't, but they still could if they want to. And some banks don't actually require a valuation regardless of whether you're outside that 10% or not. It's just a kind of rough rule of thumb, and is a bit of a guide. Your mortgage advisor will tell you whether the valuation is required as part of the property approval process. So unless you're told otherwise, you don't need to get a valuation. If the property comes back acceptable based on the intended price you're intending to pay, you don't need to get a valuation done and you should be good to go. The second reason that you may need to get a valuation done is if it's a new build property. It's almost always required by each bank. And the other main reason you may need to get a valuation done is if you're buying a property in the high LVR space, so that's with less than 20% deposit. All banks require valuations without any exceptions when the property is being purchased in that high LVR space. So you will need to get one done, and so we need to factor that into the process. So here's how the valuation can impact lending. The bank adopts the lower of the purchase price or the valuation figure when it calculates its loan to value ratio. And that loan to value ratio will dictate how much lending you can get against that property. So as an example, if you pay $1 million, and that's what you've signed on the sale and purchase agreement, and you have to get a valuation done and the valuer comes back and says, no, that property is only worth $950, and you were relying on a 90% LVR to buy that property, the bank will now only give you 90% of $950, which is $855. And so if you only had $100,000 deposit, which was the difference between $1 million purchase price and the $900,000 you were hoping for from the bank, you now have a shortfall and you've got to go and find an extra $45,000. It's a pretty example, but it can happen, and so it's something you need to be aware of and factor in before you make an offer on a property. So it's very risky getting a valuation done after auction. It is okay to do that in some cases if you've got heaps of equity and plenty of wiggle room there, if the valuer does discount the value of the property after you've bought it. But if you're reliant on a very small deposit to make the purchase work and you try and get a valuation done after the property is bought at auction, you run the risk that a valuer could come in lower, and that's going to leave you short on deposit, and at auction you've already bought the house, so now you have a problem. If the property has been sold through a real estate agent, we don't often see a huge gap between the valuation figure and the actual purchase price. However, they do often tweak it up or down $5,000 or $10,000, and it is possible that a valuer will find something that justifies a significant discount on the purchase price. So it is something that you need to be aware of. Valuations have to be ordered by your mortgage advisor, either through Velocity or CoreLogic. The bank don't want you to go direct to any valuer, because that then removes the possibility that you could choose someone that you think is going to give you the price valuation that you're looking for, and so that just removes that conflict of interest. So it has to come through your mortgage advisor, and when your mortgage advisor orders the valuation, The price for that is usually around $1,000. It can be a bit lower than that in some cases, and it can also be quite a bit higher than that. And so that price will be known to you before the order is confirmed. And valuations typically take 5 to 7 working days to be produced, so you need to factor that into your time frames when making an offer on properties. You can request that it's be done as urgent for an extra $250, and that would reduce the turnaround times to around 3 working days. It's important to note that if the property's in a regional area, sometimes those turnaround times can be slower because there may be limited availability of valuers in the area. So in summary, if you need a valuation done, your mortgage advisor is going to tell you. Don't assume that you need one, and don't just go and pay for one because you may not need to. But they are required in some cases, usually not negotiable if the bank does require it. And it's just something that you've got to get done, which comes at a bit of extra time and a bit of extra cost. But that's what needs to be done sometimes to get you across the line and get you the lending that you want to get you into that home.